Tonight, on Second Take, history has decided to update its address. Not State House, not a liberation rally, Hyde Park, Johannesburg, where a Mugabe headline reportedly meets handcuffs, bullet cartridges, and the deeply unromantic language of police procedure. Because it turns out liberation surnames, like everyone else, eventually encounter paperwork. Meanwhile, in Geneva, Blessed Mhlanga is doing something far more dangerous than shouting. He is calmly explaining, warning about repression, lawfare, and the legal choreography behind Emerson Mnangagwa's term extension debate. So tonight, we examine power in its modern forms, legacy facing process, constitutions becoming flexible documents, and authority no longer announced with slogans, but managed through law, language, and very strategic seriousness. Welcome to the show where Second Take is all we need. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth Africa rarely says out loud. On this continent, surnames are political capital. Not degrees, not job titles, not track records, surnames. Especially liberation surnames. They move ahead of you, they speak before you, and sometimes they protect you before the law even arrives. And then one day, the law arrives anyway. This week, reports emerged from Hyde Park, Johannesburg, not a battlefield, not a parliament, not a revolutionary rally, but a wealthy suburb known more for security gates than political symbolism. A shooting incident. A 23-year-old man believed to be a gardener critically injured after being shot once. Bullet cartridges reportedly found inside the house where Bellarmine Mugabe was staying. No firearm recovered. One other man arrested. Police saying the suspects are not telling them where the gun is. Investigations ongoing. Court appearance, well, that's expected. And just like that, a liberation surname enters a police docket. Now, politically speaking, this is not just a crime story. This is a legacy story. Because Robert Mugabe was not just a former president. He was a liberation icon, a political strongman, a continental figure whose authority once shaped how institutions behaved around him. For decades, the Mugabe name was not merely respected, it was feared, protected, and politically insulated. So when the youngest son of such a figure is reportedly seen in handcuffs by reporters in Johannesburg, the symbolism writes itself before the script even begins. But here is where the satire truly lives. Geography. This did not reportedly happen in a political capital where history might still whisper into institutional ears. It happened in South Africa, a country that understands liberation history deeply, but also understands, to a point, paperwork, procedure, and process. Evidence does not salute liberation credentials. And that is the quiet shift in modern African governance. Because for years, the children of powerful leaders across the continent have existed in a strange political zone, not officially above the law, but socially surrounded by caution. People lower their voices. Institutions tread carefully. Society remembers the surname and adjusts behavior accordingly. But Hyde Park is not governed by memory. It is governed by law enforcement and neighborhood complaints. Now, let us talk about optics, because Second Take is about power optics. You cannot hide a political surname in Southern Africa. It introduces itself. Now consider the deeper political satire here. The Mugabe era was built on the projection of invincibility, a presidency that stretched for decades, a leadership style that centralized authority, a political brand that blurred the line between state and individual. For years, the Mugabe name symbolized power that did not bend easily. Today, that same surname is reportedly navigating investigators, spokesperson briefings, and court processes in a foreign jurisdiction. That is not just a legal development. That is the collapse of inherited political atmosphere. And Africa is quietly watching, because across the continent, There is an unspoken expectation that the children of powerful leaders will live insulated lives, protected by wealth, networks, and historical prestige. The assumption is not always legal immunity, but social immunity. The idea that consequences arrive differently when your surname once commanded a nation. This is where satire stops being funny and starts being uncomfortable. Because liberation politics promised dignity for the ordinary African. Yet decades later, the headlines still involve elite spaces and vulnerable workers. The gardener becomes the quiet center of the story, critically injured, unnamed in global headlines, while the surname dominates the narrative. That, too, is political commentary. Now, add another layer: transnational legacy. Legacy does not retire when leaders die. It decentralizes. This is not about presumption of guilt or innocence. That remains the domain of the courts. This is about perception, and perception is political currency. The image of a Mugabe surname reportedly in handcuffs in Johannesburg travels faster than any legal clarification ever will. Optics move quicker than verdicts. For a continent still negotiating the relationship between liberation history and democratic accountability, moments like this are symbolically loud because they quietly ask a question many societies avoid. When the era of revolutionary power ends, what happens to the families that inherited its aura? Do they transition into ordinary citizens, or do they continue to move within the psychological shadow of past authority? Hyde Park, it seems, offers one possible answer. The suburb does not recognize liberation mythology as a legal category. A surname that once shaped national narratives is now reportedly part of a narrative shaped by investigators. Not ministers, not party loyalists, not state broadcasters, investigators. No speeches, no rallies, no revolutionary slogans, just a docket with the name Mugabe in it. Now, after the break, we ask if term limits have become suggestions as we get into journalist Blessed Mhlanga's warning on power and permanence in Zimbabwe at the Geneva conference.
Explore the beauty of Namibia with our car rentals. From wide open spaces to the plains of Namibia's national parks. Enjoy the freedom of the open road. Go anywhere you want, whenever you want. We've got you covered, even in the most remote locations. Visit our website and see what we have to offer.
Now, before we roll this next clip, a small institutional confession. On Second Take, we do not usually play long speeches. Not because Africa lacks speeches. On the contrary, this continent produces speeches the way others produce exports. Lengthy, passionate, historically layered, occasionally allergic to getting to the point. But today, we make an exception, deliberately. Because when a veteran journalist like Blessed Mhlanga stands in Geneva and links repression, lawfare, and constitutional engineering to a proposed term extension in Zimbabwe, that is no longer just commentary. That is political signaling dressed as testimony. And let's be honest, in African politics, term extensions are never just about time. They are about control and politely negotiating with legality. A constitution becomes elastic. A mandate becomes philosophical. And suddenly, 7 years begins to sound like administrative efficiency instead of political longevity. So yes, the video is long. I mean, uncomfortably long. But so are the consequences of constitutional amendments framed as technical adjustments. So watch closely, not for drama, not for language, for framing, for the quiet normalization of extended power explained calmly, internationally, and very strategically. Blessed Mhlanga says good night on behalf of Second Take.
Riding on protocol that has already been observed. I'm a journalist. I don't understand protocol that much. Today I appear before you wearing clothes that I have worn for 73 days in pre-trial detention. This, ladies and gentlemen, was my uniform as I suffered crimes of journalism. That was my prison number in D class section, which is kept the most dangerous criminals. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what repression looks like in Zimbabwe today. In the past, it was violence on the streets, abductions, and forced disappearances. Now, it's violence committed using the legal system. I call it lawfare. As journalist of 25 years, I've reported on Zimbabwe's democratic regression into a sophisticated authoritarian state. It was never always like this. Growing up, I idolized the president, the late Robert Gabriel Mugabe. My dad was a military veteran. He had fought in the War of Liberation to liberate our country from white colonial rule, and was a proud member of the ruling ZANU-PF party. So are some of his brothers today, who were also part of the war. We lived comfortably, as he was a soldier at that time. But then, when I was in high school, he got sick. He needed medication. But our government hospitals were dry. There was no medication. For 6 months, I watched him deteriorate. And when he died, I started asking questions, like why was our life such a mess? Ed and my father fought for our country. And did we not have enough mineral resources and taxes to provide for the sick? Especially when government top officials drive top-of-the-range vehicles, drink expensive whiskey, and dine in top hotels at our expenses and on our taxes. Ladies and gentlemen, once you start asking those questions, you cannot unask them. And I could not unsee the corruption of a government that treats public interest journalism as a security threat. So I became a journalist, reporting on stories others dared not to touch. I became the face of unmolested truth and journalism, the face of Heart and Soul TV and broadcasting, where I host a show called Free Talk. We give dissenting voices a platform, tackle corruption, and we actually ultimately broke the government's monopoly in broadcast television using multimedia means. So perhaps it came as no surprise to me why I was deemed a political threat and eventually arrested. In February 25, police came to my office with guns to arrest me, a mere man of pen, paper, and words. Fortunately for me, unfortunately for them, I was in Zambia working on a documentary. So when they could not arrest me, they posted a statement on Elon Musk's X asking the public to help in my arrest. I read this post, voluntarily flew back home, handed myself to the police voluntarily, but dear friends, they still arrested me. This was against advice from my friends, my family, my colleagues, and especially my daughter, Lorraine Ruby Mhlanga, who advised me not to return to Zimbabwe, but instead to lie low in South Africa until the situation cooled down. Like them, I knew what would happen. The state has been very consistent on how it plays its hand. They arrest opponents, punish them through pre-trial detention, and release them months later. You might be acquitted, but you would have been punished. That's what they did to opposition leader Job Scala and journalist Hopo Chingono, who spent 2 years and 80 days in prison, respectively. They were eventually acquitted, but they had been punished. They had served a pre pre-trial sentence. I decided to go home regardless, but with hindsight today, the horror and the hell that I faced in Zimbabwe's prisons, I wish I had taken the advice to flee. But here is the thing. I was arrested for a broadcast of a press conference. You can imagine. I did not say those words. The press conference was broadcast on HSTV, my employer, from an event that was organized by war veterans. The alleged violent messages were spoken by former ruling party Central Committee member Blessed Geza, who unfortunately died in exile last week, running away or evading arrest from his former colleagues who run the country today. May his soul rest in peace. The state charged me and denied me bail 3 times, in total violation of our constitution. I know that because currently I'm a second-year law student studying the law and understanding the constitution of my country. So I knew that this had nothing to do with the law. This was, and this is still purely political. The state deliberately misled the court, presented redacted transcripts from the press conference, manipulated to make the speaker sound violent. It was clear the state was using the law to do whatever it deemed necessary with me, and it did not matter what my lawyers pleaded before the courts. I spent 73 days in pre-trial detention. Prison, my friends, is a place you should never go. It is a dark place. It taints the soul and clouds one's judgment. For when in pain, alone, in an overcrowded cell, and closed out of the world, things are never the same. Their aim was to break me by exposing me to pain, intimidation, and food that was not fit for dogs to eat. My health deteriorated, and I suffered from a very violent bout of flu. It still refuses to go away to this day, but I refused to let this kill me. And through my pen and paper, and my lawyers Chris Mike and Doug Coulthard, I kept journalism alive, telling the world what life was like from inside the lice-infested prisons, where no warmth exists. From the moment I was put behind the walls, I lost my rights, my dignity, and even at times, my sanity. Although some prison guards treated me with some respect, the same is not true for other inmates who were dehumanized and abused. And at times I'm at tears when I remember those painful 3 months of my life. During my time there, I learned that the regime is not as strong as it seems. There are not that many party loyalists, but just desperate people who need the money to feed their families. They prop the regime unwillingly as enablers of the system. After 73 days, I was released on bail on May 7, 2025. But without immense international pressure and solidarity, my story could have been different. In the UK, Lord Oates brought my story before the House of Commons to debate it and to raise international attention. I deeply am indebted to that. Diplomats from Europe and America requested to visit me in prison. Fellow Zimbabweans spoke loudly about my incarceration. And just days before the diplomats could visit me in prison, I was released. I'm ever grateful. And I want to encourage you all to stand in solidarity with human rights defenders because it is the fuel of the work that we do. Even though I was released and I am standing here before you, I am not free. I have freedom without freedom. Every week, I've had to report to the police so that they know I have not escaped. My passport had been held and was only released on 21 January after my employer offered collateral of worth 200,000 United States dollars. If I don't return to Zimbabwe, the headquarters of Alpha Media Holdings, my employer, one of the last standing homes of unmolested truths and free speech, will be auctioned off by the state. So I have to go back to save that home. I have not been able to travel or earn my keep through journalism. The trial has drained me and my family financially. I've been struggling to pay my children's school fees, and now my eldest daughter, Lorraine, who is supposed to be university with his friends, is at home instead because we can't afford it. This is how the state is working. They hit your pockets, they punish everyone you love, and they torment you emotionally and physically. For a year now, they've kept delaying my trial for ridiculous reasons. 1 week, the magistrate is sick. The next, the witnesses are unavailable. And the other week, the docket is missing. My file has even been classified as a security file. Imagine, journalism is treated as a security threat in Zimbabwe. So here's the angle. When journalists don't tell the story in Zimbabwe, it's not because of incompetence. It's self-preservation, self-censorship to save themselves and their loved ones from the pains and horrors some of us have gone through. Zimbabwe is not a democracy. It's a sophisticated authoritarianism playing out as a democracy because they have learned to use the law as a weapon. They silence opponents and terrorize citizens, not through overt violence, but through a criminal justice system that many believe is compromised. Just last week, the government proposed new changes to the constitution, the major one being to increase the presidential term from 5 years to 7 years, and to allow a president to solely appoint judges directly. Those changes consolidate power into one person, killing judicial independence and further intensifying lawfare. For a president who promised to stick to the Constitution and respect human rights, these attempts open a very, very dark door, which once opened, there is no turning back. This must scare the world and the United Nations into action. Because, dear friends, when repression hides behind law and sovereignty, the poor suffer and flee from their homes. They flee from their countries as refugees, creating international crisis. They come into your homes as illegal immigrants. And we all know what's happening around the world over the issue of illegal immigrants. The problem is not caused by those who flee their homes. It is caused by you who are silent when people are repressed in their home countries, so that they cannot speak from their own home countries, but have to flee to find safety in your homes, which you then in turn chase them away. So for that not to happen, silence is not an option. Diplomatic pressure is the option. Sanctions do not work because regimes have used the sanctions to further justify oppression of the poor. It is only when we stand up and exert diplomatic pressure on these regimes that we can have results. So here's the thing. The world can pretend that Zimbabwe is democratizing, but that is a lie. If we don't speak, the West is coming. I thank you.